Rituals of sharing space. To occupy your own space by strangers in a group of people, say a chair in a theater, a seat at a conference table, or a hook to hang a towel on a tennis court, people do this in the standard way. They usually find the largest space between and choose a seat in the middle of that gap. In a theater, if no seats are specified, a person will choose a seat between the edge of the row and the first chair occupied. In a tennis court, he will necessarily choose the towel hook furthest from all the occupied hooks, within midway between the two occupied ones, or midway between the edge and the first, the middle of the edge and the middle of the first occupied hook. The aim of this ritual is not to penetrate other people's personal space and not to offend them by presumably ignoring them. In the theater, if you choose a chair right at the edge of the row, the first person in the row may feel insulted, and if you sit right next to him or her, you may feel frightened. So the main ritual of space-sharing principle is to maintain harmony and balance. The exception to this rule is the choice of seats in public toilets. Studies show that 90% of people choose the outskirts, and only if both edge cubicles are occupied, the halfway principle comes into play. Don't forget to click the subscribe button to help my channel grow, giving me the motivation to keep creating content. Zone sizes and cultural factors. A young couple, who had recently moved from Denmark to Chicago, were invited to participate in the Young Entrepreneurs Club. After a few weeks, the women at the club began to complain that the Danish man were sexually harassing them and that they felt uncomfortable around him. Meanwhile, the men in the club noticed that the Danish woman was using nonverbal cues to indicate that she was sexually available to them. This situation is due to the fact that in most European countries the intimate area is only 23 to 25 centimeters, and in some countries it is even smaller. The Danes felt completely comfortable standing just 25 centimeters away from the Americans, without even suspecting that they were encroaching significantly on the 18-inch American private domain. In addition, the Danes used eye contact more than the Americans, which only served to reinforce the Americans' unfounded suspicions against them. Invasion of the intimate territory of an individual of the opposite sex is a way of demonstrating one's sexual interest in that person. If such a move into the intimate territory of a person of the opposite sex is unacceptable, the other person will take a step back, keeping the sovereignty of the intimate area. Otherwise, he will leave where he is, allowing the intruder to remain in his intimate area. What seemed like normal communication to the Danish couple was sexual harassment to the Americans. Meanwhile, the Danes had the impression that the Americans were cold and unfriendly because they were constantly pulling back during the interaction in order to maintain a distance at which they felt comfortable. At a recent conference, I noticed that when the Americans met to talk, they stood about 90 centimeters apart and maintained that distance for the duration of the conversation. If you are interested in my content, don't forget to click the subscribe button. Meanwhile, when the American was spoken to by the Japanese, the two of them began to move slowly in a circle around the room, as the American had to keep moving away from the Japanese, who in turn kept creeping closer and closer to the American. This process demonstrated the efforts of both the American and the Japanese to keep a culturally determined distance from each other. The Japanese intimate area is only 25 centimeters, so the Japanese, in order to achieve the optimum communication distance for himself, the Japanese would try to stand right next to the American. However, in doing so, he was constantly into the American's intimate area, forcing him to retreat and seek the optimum communication distance. This conversation was filmed, and the video recordings, shown at an increased speed, constituted the impression that the two men were waltzing in a conference room, with the Japanese man as the host. It is quite understandable why, when negotiating business, Asian and American people look at each other with a certain suspicion. Americans call Asians too pushy, and Asians see Americans as cold and formal. Lack of knowledge about the differences in the size of intimate areas between cultures can easily lead to misunderstandings and lead to unwarranted assumptions by one culture towards another. If you like my content, click the subscribe and like buttons. See you later.